October 1st, 2015, Roseburg, Oregon. A small college campus, a quiet classroom, a normal day, until the gunfire begins. Chris Harper-Mercer walked into an Umpqua Community College, armed with 6 guns and a twisted plan. 9 people lost their lives that day. 8 more were injured. And by the end of it all, Harper-Mercer was dead by suicide. Another mass shooting in America. Another killer, another round of headlines. But when the dust settled, investigators found something chilling. Not just weapons, but writings, journals, manifestos, online posts. And in those pages was a man who didn't just want to hurt people. He wanted to be seen. He didn't want to kill because he thought it was the right thing. He killed because he thought it was the only way to matter. And that belief that visibility equals value, is quietly eating away at the hearts of thousands more who feel just like he once did. So this episode is not about excusing what happened. Instead, it's about exposing the lie that Harper-Mercer believed, and the deeper truth that could have saved him from believing that lie. So let's start off with who he was. Chris Harper-Mercer was only 26 years old. He was socially isolated, emotionally withdrawn. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. He lived with his mother, but he spent long hours online, and he struggled to form relationships. Classmates described him as quiet, sometimes friendly, sometimes strange. His digital footprint, however, revealed a far darker world that he was in. He was obsessed with mass shootings. He studied them. He memorized the names. He familiarized himself with the weapons and the motives and the body counts. And in time, he began to see himself not as a student or a son or even a person, but as someone who is destined to become a name on that list of mass murderers. He believed that he was invisible and that by taking lives, he'd at least finally be acknowledged. Not loved, not known, just noticed. So let's pause right there, because that's where this story stops becoming unique. See, that hunger to be seen, to be chosen, to feel like your life has impact, that's not evil. That's a very human feeling. The problem, though, is what Harper-Mercer did with that hunger. He fused it with fantasy. He weaponized his loneliness, and he saw the attention that other shooters received, and he convinced himself, this is how I'll finally be a somebody. This wasn't about ideology. It was about significance. And that's what makes this story so dangerous, because there are countless others right now who are feeling quiet and disconnected and simmering, and who are wondering, would anyone care if I disappear? And if the answer feels like a no, the next question then is, then how do I make them care? Harper-Mercer didn't wake up one day and decide to commit violence. It built slowly. The resentments, the rejection, the comparison, the fantasies of being noticed, not as himself, but as something terrifying. And through it all, he remained quiet and polite and low-key. And that's what makes this kind of pain so easy to miss. It doesn't scream. It simmers. It smiles while detaching. It nods while fantasizing. It goes it goes unnoticed until it refuses to be unnoticed any longer. In one of his writings, Harper-Mercer said this. He said, "The more people you kill, the more you're in the limelight." Now that's a horrible sentence, but it was honest. He wasn't looking for domination. He was looking for recognition. And in a world where love felt impossible and friendship felt out of reach, he grabbed onto the only form of attention that he believed was still available, and that was fear. This is a twisted logic that emerges when pain festers in the dark. If I can't be loved, at least I'll be feared. If I can't be chosen, at least I'll be unavoidable. If I can't be wanted, at least I won't be ignored. But none of this happens in a vacuum, does it? Chris Harper-Mercer was shaped by something larger than just his loneliness. He lived in a culture where performance is everything, where your worth is earned through visibility, where being admired, or at least noticed, feels like the only way to matter. Add to that the glorification of violence in the media, the viral coverage of past mass shooters, the endless online forums that turn isolation into one's identity. And what you get is a blueprint for self-destruction that looks a lot like significance. And this is where society, we must own our parts, because we create the environment where this lie thrives. That if you're not seen, you're not real. That if you're not wanted, you're not worthy. That your life only has value if it's witnessed. And that is a deeply broken message, isn't it? And this message, this lie leads people, especially men, to believe that attention is salvation. But attention is not intimacy. And visibility is not love. And being remembered is not the same as being known. Chris Harper-Mercer didn't understand that. He thought being infamous was better than being visible, or invisible, I should say. And that belief killed 9 people. Let's linger a little longer on the emotional world that Harper-Mercer lived in. Not the violence, but the void that came before it, because what strikes you when you're reading through his journals and through the digital footprints isn't a man that's full of rage. It's a man that is drowning in emptiness. He didn't rant, he didn't shout, he grieved. He grieved not just the absence of romantic or sexual connection, but he grieved the absence of significance. In his own words, he said, "I've been invisible all of my life." Let that sink in. In his mind, invisibility wasn't a season. It wasn't just a phase. It was a permanent condition in his perception. It was an identity. And when someone starts to believe that about themselves, when they start to believe that no one sees them, no one chooses them, no one will ever care whether they're here or not, well, that's when despair becomes dangerous. And it's important to understand something here. See, Chris Harper-Mercer, I don't think he wanted to be violent. I think what he really wanted was to be valid. He wanted the world to reflect back that he actually mattered. He wanted women to see him as desirable. He wanted his peers to admire him. He wanted to count. He wanted to be noticed. But when none of that happened, when every effort to engage with life seemed to end in rejection or indifference, he began to search for another script, a darker script, one that still ended with people finally saying his name. And this is where visibility becomes a trap. Because the moment someone starts to believe that being seen in any form is the highest good, they're going to pursue it at any cost. even at the cost of lives. So let's not mistake this for narcissism. Harper-Mercer was not obsessed with being adored. He was obsessed with being acknowledged. And when the world only acknowledges pain after it's exploded, we teach the next lonely person something very dangerous. And that is that suffering in silence is your job until you make all the rest of us notice. But what if someone had noticed sooner, though? What if they'd noticed not his silence, not his strangeness, not his discomfort, but instead if someone had actually noticed his pain behind all of this? If they'd only noticed his longing or the confusion, the fear that he was the only one who's living on the outside of this life. Because that fear, it's not rare. In fact, I would say that fear is everywhere. There are men walking into schools and offices and coffee shops today who feel exactly the way that Chris Harper-Mercer felt before his gunfire. Unwanted, uninterested, uninvited. And most of these men I don't think they'll become violent, but some of them carry this seed, a dark little belief that says, if I ever decide to make people see me, they'll never forget. See, that belief doesn't start in evil. It starts in absence. So what's really missing here? See, at the core, it's intimacy. Not the romantic kind of intimacy, not the sexual kind of intimacy, but the relational kind of intimacy. I define intimacy as intimacy. It's the experience of being known, of being listened to, of being able to say, here's where I hurt, and not being laughed at or dismissed or ignored. Harper-Mercer never found that. Or maybe more accurately, he never believed that it was available to him. Because when you're told to toughen up, or to get over it, or to stop being awkward, to stop expecting connection unless you've earned it, well, you learn to keep your ache to yourself. And when that pain never leaves, it starts looking for power. Power is the counterfeit of connection. It gives this illusion of control, the illusion of presence, the illusion of value, and violence in its most warped form becomes a shortcut to experiencing power. I think that's what Harper-Mercer chased at the very core. Not because he loved violence, but because it promised something that he couldn't find any other way, and that was a voice. He believed that the only way to make the world hear him was to hurt the world. Let's sit with that for a second. Because while his actions were horrifying, his desire was tragically familiar. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to matter. He wanted someone to say, I see you, I hear you, you count, you matter, you're worthwhile. And when that didn't happen, he gave himself the final word. And that's what mass violence often is. It's this desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative control, to make a world that ignored you finally listen, even if it's with blood. But it doesn't have to end that way. Visibility isn't the only answer to loneliness. Fame or infamy isn't the same as being known. And the final word doesn't need to become a headline or a body count. It can come in a conversation or in a confession, in a truth that's spoken aloud before it turns toxic. And what Chris Harper-Mercer needed wasn't a platform. He needed a person, someone who was there to say, you're not invisible, brother. Your pain is real, and you don't have to carry this alone. I'm here with you in this moment. But he didn't hear that. And so he listened to the lie instead. Let's talk a little bit about that script, because Chris Harper-Mercer didn't invent the idea that suffering makes you significant. He didn't invent the fantasy that if you can't be loved, you can still be remembered. He simply followed a script that already pre-existed. It's written into countless of online forums. It's whispered in corners of incel communities. It's threaded through the dark corners of YouTube and Reddit and even Discord. And it goes something like this. It says, you've been rejected. You've been ignored. You've been overlooked. You've been mocked. You don't matter in this world. No one notices you. But if you hurt enough people, then they'll finally see you. See, this script is poison because for so many it feels like relief. It gives men who feel worthless a sense of control. And it turns invisibility into a weapon. And worst of all, it gives pain a purpose. But at the very core, it's a lie. It's a seductive, devastating lie, because attention is not the same as connection. And fear is not the same as love. And making someone remember your name in horror is not the same as being known. See, Chris Harper-Mercer believed that if no one would choose him in life, he could force them to acknowledge him in death. But that belief didn't start with evil. It started with emptiness. He was looking for proof that his existence meant something, that he hadn't lived and died as a ghost. He wanted to mark the world. And the thing was, he was surrounded by a culture that told him that being chosen means being worthwhile, that being wanted means that you're real, that being visible means that you are valuable. And so when no one chose him, when no one wanted him, when no one took the time to see him, he drew a deadly conclusion. And that was where he said, then I'm not going to go quietly. That's the illusion of the final word. It's this belief that violence lets you reclaim what rejection stole in the first place. That hurting others proves your humanity, and that forcing recognition is far better than just fading out. That tragedy is better than anonymity. And here's the truth that Harper-Mercer didn't live long enough to learn. And it's this truth. It's that you don't need to be chosen to be valuable. You don't need to be seen to be real, and you don't need to be wanted to be worthwhile. And the final word isn't written in violence. No, the final word is written in vulnerability, courageous vulnerability. So how do we interrupt this script that he was following? It's not by arguing about ideology. It's not by banning books or forums or manifestos, but instead by offering an alternative story, one where a man's worth isn't measured by desirability, where loneliness is not a moral failing, and where being unseen doesn't mean you're unloved. It just means you're unreached. One where men are allowed to say, I am struggling, or I don't feel wanted, or I don't know how to be close to anyone, or I feel forgotten. Instead of being mocked or minimized, should they say these? They're not met with pity, with panic, but instead we bring them presence, because here's the truth. There are people right now who are closer than we think to the same emotional cliff that Harper-Mercer stood on. People who are hurting quietly, people who are fantasizing, not about violence necessarily, but about the escape, about being seen finally, no matter what that cost looks like. And unless they hear a different message, a message of dignity, of connection, of truth, they're going to keep rehearsing the lie. And that's why intimacy matters so desperately right now. Not just romantic intimacy, but an emotional intimacy. The kind that says, intimacy. What a courageous move. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's awkward, even when it makes one feel exposed. Intimacy is what breaks the script, because it tells you you don't need to perform. You don't need a persona. You don't need to destroy anything to prove that you exist and that you matter. You just need to be courageously honest. And I'm still going to stay here. And that's what integrity offers too, you see. Integrity means you're aligning what's happening on the inside with how you experience and live on the outside. It means refusing to pretend, refusing to bury the pain, refusing to shame to shame yourself and your story. And Harper-Mercer had that pain. That's not what made him dangerous, though. What made him dangerous was that his pain went unspoken for so long that he thought he had no choice but to scream into the world with bullets. But there is another choice. And there's always another choice, right? We can't undo what Harper-Mercer did. We can't bring back the lives that he stole. But what we can do is to understand how he got there. And we can make sure fewer men walk down that same road. And we do that by changing what we reward, what we model, what we invite. And what we stop rewarding, like performance, we can instead start rewarding other components like being present. We stop modeling perfection, and instead we start modeling honesty. We stop inviting competition, and instead we start inviting true connection. Because at the end of the day, that's what Harper-Mercer wanted the most. Not blood, not headlines, not domination. I think what he really wanted was to be seen and to be chosen. He wanted someone to say, you matter, even now. And that is something that we can still offer, especially to the ones who haven't exploded yet, to the ones who are still within our reach. If we're willing to see those signs, if we're willing to ask the hard questions, if we're willing to sit in the silence and say, I see you, I care. And you don't have to write your name in violence to be known. So now we return to that classroom in Oregon, where those students were gathering, expecting a lecture most likely, where laughter and maybe the rustling of backpacks was filling the air, where no one could have imagined that someone would walk in carrying more than weapons. But they were also bringing along a story that no one had listened to. Harper-Mercer didn't just bring violence into that room. He brought years of silence as well. Years of pain, years of believing that he was the exception to love, to being a part of this collective human experience and story. And when those beliefs went unchallenged long enough, they hardened into something deadly. But it didn't have to end that way, did it? His pain was real, yes. His actions were monstrous. And those two truths can actually live side by side, because naming his humanity does not erase his responsibility. And recognizing his wounds does not in any way minimize the horror of what he did. Instead, it gives us a chance to finally say, this is where things could have been different. Different how, though? If someone had seen beneath the surface, if someone had asked maybe better questions, right? If someone maybe had said something like, you're not alone, brother, let's talk, let's connect. If the culture around him had made space for awkwardness instead of shaming it. See, for male loneliness, For male loneliness, it's often ridiculed. There's this emotional pain that we often turn into pathology. If he had known that longing was not a weakness, and if someone had told him that intimacy was not a trophy to be earned, that being unwanted does not mean you're unworthy, that if he'd been shown that power is not what makes us whole, connection is what makes us whole, then maybe, just perhaps, we could have been spared. And that's why we tell these stories. We tell them not to relive the trauma. It's not to sensationalize the violence in any way. But instead, we tell these stories to understand that the pain, the ache, happened before it all. Because at the center of most of these atrocities is a person who once simply just wanted to be seen and to belong. And that doesn't excuse a harm, but it does expose what has been missing. And if we're honest, what's missing is actually everywhere. I mean, how many people do you know who've said aloud, how many men specifically have you heard who've said aloud, I feel lonely, or I don't think anyone wants me, or I feel like I'm invisible, or I'm afraid that I'm going to die without ever feeling loved? How many men have you heard say that? Because I would say most haven't, because most can't. We've made those admissions feel like disqualifications in a cultural context. It's like a proof of failure of one's masculinity, instead of what they really are, and that is proof of being alive, of being human. So what if we normalized these statements? What if we started inviting conversations that made that kind of honesty feel safe? Not just on podcasts, not at dinner tables only, not in classrooms, but also on the sidewalks, in friend groups, in workplaces, in society, in families. Because if we don't, we leave men to find their own answers, and some of those answers end up in headlines. So let's say this plainly. Chris Harper-Mercer chose violence, yes. He caused irreparable harm. He ended lives tragically, and nothing will ever justify that. But beneath the horror is a reality that we can't afford to ignore. He believed the only way to exist was to destroy. He believed that pain meant nothing unless it was witnessed. And he believed that being feared was better than being forgotten. And the world that he lived in did very little to tell him otherwise. But we can start telling a different story. One where visibility does not define one's worth. Where being chosen is not a requirement for being lovable. Where men don't have to explode to be seen. We can model intimacy, the kind that goes beyond performance. The kind that says intimacy, even when what's inside feels ugly. It's the kind that says, I'm still going to be here even if you don't feel enough. We can model what integrity could look like. The kind that refuses to pretend. The kind that aligns truth on the inside with our actions on the outside. The kind that says, I'm hurting today and I'm not going to hide behind it with arrogance or silence or rage. That's the work, not just for incels or for isolated men, but for all of us, because disconnection is not a fringe experience. It's a very human one. So here's the invitation today, in this moment, to all of you who are listening. Let's become the kind of people who notice, who look beneath the politeness, who listen for the longing underneath the jokes, who ask the second question when someone may shrug off the first one. Let's become the people who disrupt the myth that says you're only as real as the attention you're able to get. You're only as valuable as the people who choose you. You're only as worthy as the status you can earn. Let's replace that myth with something far better. something quieter, something truer. And it's a belief that says you matter even when no one is watching, and you're seen even when it looks like you're not, or that you belong even if you haven't felt it yet. The final word isn't written in violence. The final word is actually connection. And it's not too late to speak it. Not just for others, but maybe for the first time, even for yourself. And what a better time to start than now.